Perfect, thank you. All right, so I want us to start by, how do you say hello in your language? Meaning any dialect or language that you would like to say it. If you could share it in the chat or unmute and say hello.
Hey.
Love it. Oops, sorry. Anyone else? I'm going to try to say that. Wagwan. Did I say that okay? All right. Sort of.
Oh, where my parents are from, some people would say, "What going on, buddy?" So
I like that. See, that's that accent that's very difficult to duplicate. I love it. Anyone else? In Arabic, it would be marhaba. I am Egyptian Arabic, first in my family, born in the US. And like I said, I have a passion for languages. Let's go on here. Okay, so quick agenda, just going to go through this. I am going to, I did abbreviate this because I did present this at NAJISHA. So I changed some of the statistics for New York, of course, and I made it a little shorter. So if I go through anything a little too fast, let me know. I can always go back. But I know that we didn't want to spend as long, obviously. I had a 2-hour presentation there. We're not going to be there that long. So some basic definitions of terms. I always feel like it's good to go back to our roots because we sometimes forget the basic definitions. So looking at dialect is the language that is specific to a certain region or group. Dialectical density is the quantification of that dialect that the speaker uses. So some people use a little bit of the dialect in their speech. Some people have a thicker density, so they'll use it a lot more. Dialectical differences are the regional and social variations that occur. So it gets into more of our social personality. Dual language learner is somebody who's learning 2 languages simultaneously. The reason why I put it out there that I am not a bilingual speech therapist is because I am constantly asked to do bilingual evaluations, because once they find out I speak Arabic, and there are not many, people want me to, evaluate or translate at meetings or all of that. As you can tell, I was born and raised here. I do not have an Egyptian accent. When I speak Egyptian, I have an accent. And people tend to think that I come from Kuwait or from Saudi Arabia or somewhere else because my Egyptian Arabic sounds off. Thank you so much, Leanne. I appreciate it. I love it. Juliet, great. I'm going to try. Bienvenue. Okay, maybe in Haitian Creole. I love it. Thank you. So when I say that I'm not officially bilingual, I do not find myself proficient in both languages equally. So that is why I say I'm not. Will I translate and help out, especially with our Syrian refugees? Absolutely. Syrian Arabic is a different language, but I do try to find common ground with them in the Arabic. But that's something that we need to recognize. Just because a person speaks a certain language does not mean they're proficient in it. And that is something that we take for granted as well. English language learner, I'm sure you are familiar with these terms, so we're going to skip that and move on. Sorry. Mainstream American English. So this is the primary dialect of the English language spoken in North America. This is what you will typically hear on your CNN news channels, basic news. And then non-mainstream are the secondary dialects that are influenced by your region. So you can usually tell their English sounds a little different. So Juliet said she's from the South. There are words that are a little different. There are terms that are different, accents on words. You can tell somebody who's coming from Boston, somebody who's coming from another area. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. Speech sound disorders, of course, errors in articulation, when there are physical difficulties that are present, keeping children from making the correct pronunciation. So why is it so important? Ethically. Everything we do is surrounded by ethics. ASHA has their position on multicultural practice. We need to have best practice, more accurate diagnosis and treatment. Like I said, when we look at dialect and we appreciate it, we no longer overdiagnose students, and we put them in the correct programs to get them the right help that they need. And then, of course, cultural and linguistic awareness. We need to be culturally aware. We need to be linguistically aware, especially in...
Sorry, I couldn't hear
apparently my Apple Watch thought I was talking to her. I apologize. Especially in a region that is growing. You know, we live in New York, and it is just booming with so many different languages. And we need to be aware, of course. So required competencies, just briefly, of course, the speech language pathologist has to have certain competencies to distinguish between a dialectical difference and a communication disorder. That includes recognizing all American English dialects are rule-governed linguistic systems. Some people forget that. Speech pathologists are guilty of it, and I've seen it so many times. You know, a student, you know, speaks African American vernacular English, or they or Black English. I know different terms. You know, we have, you know, a New York accent might come in there. I personally moved from New York to Marlborough, New Jersey when I was in high school, and let me tell you, culture shock. And everybody thought that, you know, suddenly I didn't speak English well because I spoke, you know, more of a New York English. And then, and at the time I wasn't wearing the scarf, but I stood out a little bit. You know, so we need to stop, again, these biases and know that every dialect has its own linguistic system and is a full language. Once you understand the rules and linguistic features of your specific clients, you can better work with them and serve them. And then, of course, being familiar with non-discriminatory testing, which is extremely important. There are so many biases that are in a lot of our standardized tests. You have to be aware of, you know, identifying the potential bias that can be in there, administering and scoring standardized tests, observing non-traditional interviews and language sample techniques, and then, of course, analyzing test results in light of existing information. Okay. Some persisting difficulties. Basically, I found in the research that I did that children, you know, who are found to have dialectical differences and did not receive the appropriate services to remedy these differences are at high risk of having issues with language, reading difficulties, and writing difficulties throughout their lifetime. So this is not something that goes away. So when a student is inappropriately diagnosed, they're not getting the correct help that they need, and it can impact them later. Childhood speech disorders can have a negative impact on academic performance, can extend to their psychosocial realms, and can impact their vocational choices. So believe it or not, there were so many studies that were found that when a person was felt that their dialect was not equal to those around them, they chose to not go to fields that they could have worked in, even though they had the educational and mental background to do so. So meaning you have that student that feels that, you know, I might come from this region and people, whenever I speak in this dialect, look at me a little differently and, you know, think I'm uneducated automatically and assume with their bias, I'm not going to apply for that job because I can't get it. And they automatically shut themselves down and cut their opportunities in life, which I thought was heartbreaking. And I've seen it. I've seen it happen. I know people who have done it. I know so many people who have, you know, thick accents or certain regional dialects, and they automatically assume they can't hold that job in the office or they can't be the one answering the phone. And we need to stop those biases and those thought understandings. Speech sound disorders, of course, can negatively impact social emotional well-being, levels of participation, and literacy development. And when children are not assessed correctly, it may result in inappropriate provision or denial of services. So we're either giving them services they don't need and pulling them from classes and things that they should be in, or we're giving them, we're not giving them services at all. So some of the numbers here. I apologize. Okay, sorry. Gotta love computers. All right. So some of the numbers here. This is looking at the percentage of public school students who are ELL by state. This was updated to, it was funny because in the last month since I gave the presentation, the website updated it from fall 2017 to fall 2018. I guess they don't go sooner than that. But just to show you that, I mean, there has been change since then, but not as much as we would assume. But looking here, you have the percentage of students that were English language learners went up to 10.2% in schools. That's about 5 million students. So anybody that is a school-based SLP, working in clinics, hospitals, we're working with these children, and about 5 million of these students are English language learners. and that is up about 8% since 2000. Looking at the 10 most commonly reported home languages in the US, we have Spanish is number 1 at over 3 million. Arabic, number 2 at 136,000. Chinese, English, Vietnamese. And when it says English here, I want you to know that it means, hold on. Those who reported English language learners in their home, including students that are living in multilingual households. So English is one of the languages there, or students that were adopted from other countries are included in that English number as English language learners. Vietnamese, Somali, Russian, Portuguese, Haitian and Haitian Creole, and Hmong. So this is again throughout the whole US. When we look at those who speak another language, a language other than English in their home, just looking from 1980 to 2017, you can see these numbers tripled. We're looking at 23 million going to 66 million. These numbers are not going to be going down anytime soon. They're only expected to go up from there. And we have over 20% share speaking a language other than English at home. So again, there are these dialectical influences that are coming into their language, into their speech. Looking specifically at New York, languages spoken at home in New York, the top 10, English, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, Indo-European, Italian, French Creole, Korean, French, and Tagalog. And these numbers did shift a lot from New Jersey, which I thought was interesting. You're right over the bridge, but the top 10, about 5 of them are different when you look from just New Jersey to New York. Like for example, Arabic is in the top 10 in New Jersey and is not in New York. It's actually number 14. So it shifts a bit. So again, looking at, even somebody like me who works between New York and New Jersey a lot, you have to take in those cultural considerations, who are the populations that you might be most exposed to in certain areas. So ASHA member statistics, this is where it gets rough. As you know, there's a reason S.I.S.T.A.s exists. The only 8.5% of ASHA members identify as a racial minority, as opposed to the 27.6% of the US population. So again, we are asking members to be culturally aware in cultures that are not necessarily representative of ASHA. And it's extremely important that we expand our knowledge base. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. Dialects. So you look at accent versus dialect, regional dialect, social dialect, and ethnic. So we're going to get into them here. The difference between an accent and dialect, which I found a lot of people didn't realize that there are differences between the two. So an accent is a distinction in your pronunciation. It's basically how you say the words, the way you sound. So oftentimes you hear somebody speak and you're like, oh, you sound like you have a little bit of French in your language, or you sound like you maybe have a little Spanish in your language as you're speaking, that little bit of accent. All speakers have an accent. So if you say, I don't speak with an accent, you're wrong. Everybody has an accent. It depends. It just depends what kind of accent you have and where it's from, but everybody speaks in an accent. What happens is you tend to speak the accent of your community. So if you live and stay within a community and there aren't people coming into the community or going out, all of you will have the same accent, and therefore we don't hear that distinction in the sounds. But when you go somewhere else to another region, another area, that's where the accent comes out, and people can identify that it sounds different. Dialects, however, are full language systems. They have a specific vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciations, and they're used by members of a specific group. So not necessarily the entire community speaking that dialect, but of a specific group. So regional dialects are a variety of language associated with a specific region. They're often produced through historical linguistic process of change in a language. So it happens over time, and it happens with contact with speakers of another language. So for example, if you look at, in the South, they'll have a regional dialect. They may say, y'all come over for supper instead of why don't you all come over? And there are different dialectical differences. And that is because of the influence of the languages that have come to those regions. An isogloss is when there's a boundary between two regional dialects. So sometimes some dialectical shifts will come in between those two regions, and it causes an isogloss, so a combination between the two. Social dialects are a variety of languages that are associated with a specific, a particular social group. So for example, as New Yorkers, you know, when I moved to Jersey, people would know that I had a New York accent because when I got really mad or really upset, my R's disappeared, as often we do in this region. So that is a regional dialect. Believe it or not, in some areas, removing your R is considered being of a working class or a lower socioeconomic status. However, removal of R in an area such as Charleston is actually considered to be someone of a higher social class. So again, it's interesting how these social dialects, depending on where you are and who is listening to your dialect and who is interpreting your dialect, will have an influence on how you're perceived from others within the area. And it's based on age group, socioeconomic class, and gender. As it's Pride Month right now, as we know, a lot of people will say, oh, they sound like they're gay. And I know that some people like that saying, some people don't. But again, that is a social dialect, talking in a certain mannerism around certain people and within a certain group. And some people do like being identified within that region and that group. Ethnic dialects, or an ethnolect, is when you look at a variety of dialect that is associated with a particular ethnic group. So that's where we have African American Vernacular English or Urban English. And I'm going to ask the members of the group, because I always ask this around. A lot of people like calling it differently. So I want to know, what does the group here feel that it should be called? Oops, sorry. Because I know there's been a lot of shift in the writings. African American Vernacular English. Okay. African American English. Okay. All right. I know there's been a lot of shifts in certain journal articles, certain things. I know that it is changed to Black English. Yep, exactly. I've seen it written as Urban English lately. And I know in regions where, like where I work, I've seen it shift to Urban English because the reasoning that I was given was that such a large Hispanic population was using the same dialectical differences, so they changed it to an Urban English. But again, I always look to make sure that I'm saying what agrees with everyone. Great. Okay. So ethnic dialect are varieties of language that identify speakers as members of a specific ethnic group. So I'm Egyptian. There are certain varieties in language, certain ways that we say things that are considered, you know, Arabic English or Egyptian English. And when I say Egyptian, because Arabic is such a broad term, just like Spanish is such a broad term, and there's so many dialects within that, Arabic is the same. So you can tell somebody, like I said before, you know, my Arabic is a little off, my Egyptian Arabic. So I tend to sound like I might come from like Saudi Arabia, a little different. So these speakers previously spoke another language sometimes, and then that influence comes into their English language or what they're currently speaking. Oops, sorry. Still in the chat. So now we look at assessment. Evaluation and assessment should always be conducted using a variety of measures. We can't just use, like I said, the Goldman-Fristow, look at those scores and call it, you know, done. And now I've evaluated this child and I have my results. There is no single assessment method that is sufficient on its own. And we have to look at dialectical consideration. We have to look at cultural considerations. We have to look at background information. We need to do that interview. We need to talk with parents, talk with the child, see, you know, what they feel. And I apologize because I actually realized I skipped over one. So I'm going to go back real quick. Speech sound disorders, of course, as we know, when mistakes occur past the age of acquisition, they are very different than dialectical differences. They're a combination of difficulties with perception, articulation, phonological representation, speech segments, phonotactics, prosody, grammatical tones, rhythm, stress, intonation, and they impact speech intelligibility and acceptability. So I just wanted to put that out there because I feel like it's very important that we look at the difference between the two. So with assessment, again, we need to look at all of the parts of assessment. Formal testing. So for anybody who works in a school, I personally work in a school where when I started, which is why I found out a lot of these problems happened, they require formal testing. They want formal testing. So I work in Elizabeth. I did a lot of contracted work for Newark. Newark was actually a little more firm with that. They want standardized tests. They don't care if a child doesn't speak English. They don't care if their language does not really have standardized tests, because I'll tell you right now, there are no standardized tests in Arabic for speech and language. They're just starting to formulate some and they're not available. But they would tell me, you know what, just give them the English test anyway. We need a score. So that's why I got very active with NAJISHA and working on changing the legislation, changing the rules, and I'm very active within my district. And I have to say it has shifted a lot since then. We now no longer require the standardized testing. We need to advocate for ourselves. We need to let people know that we are the experts. There's a reason we have all those initials after our names. There are reasons that we were speech pathologists and audiologists, and we are the experts. We need to let people know that and know why we need to be listened to. So there are a lot of issues with formal testing, as we know. There's a lot of bias that is in formal testing. So many times I'm giving kids these tests and I'm showing them a wheelbarrow and I'm showing them pictures that they just have never been exposed to. And now I'm marking it wrong. They don't know this, they don't know that. They can't pronounce this word because they've never heard it before. And you can't take those words into account. You have to take it with a grain of salt and write that in your functional testing. Again, with formal testing, it only shows if an error is present. So again, you give that Goldman-Fristow, you've got that whole list of errors that goes down there. It says if an error is present or not. So an error is anything that doesn't match the testing as it's written. It doesn't give you an interpretation of results. It doesn't give you variability in your interpretation. It doesn't allow for medical considerations or cultural considerations or anything else that could be impacting the way the child is saying those things, those words. And it takes away a lot of the richness of the language and it makes everything black and white. And as we know, it's not that simple. There are a lot of gray tones that we need to take into account. Some formal testing measures here. These are the ones that were identified in my particular school district as being the most used. So the Goldman-Fristow was number 1, Kahn-Lewis, photo articulation test, the PAT. The DELV was one that, believe it or not, was high on the list, but nobody used it because we couldn't get it. So I'm actually fighting to get that one in my district. Anybody here familiar with the DELV? Oh, I see a hand raised. Great. And that is great because it was something that a few people had said that they wanted, but nobody had, and nobody had given. And I personally hadn't given it. I learned about it. So the DELV, for those who don't know, is the Diagnostic Evaluation of Language Variation. And it is a group of assessments that it's unique because it's the only language assessment series, actually, that accounts for diversity in American English. And it identifies children who are at risk or show signs of a speech or language disorder. But it also is designed to reduce over-inclusion of students in special education due to linguistic and cultural differences, rather than just speech and language disorders. So it actually looks at the linguistic difference that occurs in speech, which I think is phenomenal. The bilingual articulation phonology assessment, Spanish, Spanish articulation measures, and the Spanish language assessment procedures, the SLAT, were also top rated measures that people like to use. So now we get into our functional. Oops. So functional assessment, it helps you to, functional assessment allows you to gain information on development. It allows for interviews, personal measures. You get to get really personal with the family, with the student. You get to talk to them without any standardized measures and without a script. You can ask what you want here. It involves the parents and the caregivers. It can occur in a variety of settings. So it doesn't have to be in a quiet room with no distractions. We can, do our functional assessment in the cafeteria with the students, or we can take that student in the clinic outside on the playground, or we can take that client in the hospital out, you know, in the lounge or in the cafeteria. And that's the place where they really want to speak the most because they're comfortable. I used to work in the hospital setting, and the kids didn't want to talk in their room because their room reminded of them all of all the needles that they got and all the shots and all the procedures. And just taking them out in the hallway and roaming, or, you know, to the cafeteria and sitting for a little bit, that's where I really got that good language sample. So we need to think of that. We don't always have to do it in our, you know, in our office or in our room. It helps to avoid the stereotyping that often occurs. It allows therapists to rule out other conditions, other reasons, such as developmental delay, sensory deficits, motor speech disorders. We can really see the differences that occur when we do functional assessment. And then assessment result. Excuse me 1 second. As speech therapists, we know how much we have to stay hydrated. And as speech therapists, we also know how much it's important to stay caffeinated after a long day at work. So results from assessment can be used to determine eligibility and services. It helps us set our intervention goals. It helps us determine ESL services and bilingual classes and give our recommendations to others. When you start, I learned in the beginning, I used to be shy and quiet and not really want to make waves in my school. That has changed. Now everybody knows that I am the one who makes waves. I am the one who speaks out. I am the advocate for all. And it's great because when you realize that you don't have to be afraid and you don't have to be quiet, and you are always respectful and always sharing, and you come with knowledge, people actually start calling you on you more and wanting to know more and wanting to ask questions. And I always tell people I'm an open book. So my students know that they can come up to me. You know, my intern, I have to say, was shocked because I had one of my students come up, brand new student to me, and said, "Why do you wear that thing on your head?" And she, you know, my intern automatically turned, you know, pale. She's like, "What's going on?" You know, and I just took it as a learning opportunity. We spoke about it. We talked about it. Next thing you know, the little girl was asking me to wrap her hair, and we're sitting there and we're joking. We made a whole speech session out of it. And she said, "How are you so comfortable about that and okay with it?" And I said, "Because I became comfortable in my own skin." And when you become comfortable in your own skin, people can't impact you as much. Am I going to say it doesn't hurt when I get insulted and I get comments and things like that? Absolutely not. Of course it does. I'm not that thick-skinned. But when you become comfortable in yourself, you hold your head a little higher and you make people look at you more. And the more people look, the more they learn. One of my favorite things that I did I did a multicultural consideration workshop at S.I.S.T.A.s. And the portion that I came up with, which is my favorite thing, which I think I'm going to be doing a lot, is let's get uncomfortable. It literally was, I gave people situations and scenarios that would make them uncomfortable, that they had to talk about, and they had to discuss with each other. And when I tell you, you know, everybody was quiet and silent, nobody wanted to participate. And then all of a sudden, people started having these conversations and realizing that it's not until you get uncomfortable that you start learning, and you start learning about others and being more open to others. So that's something that I always like putting out there because I feel it's so important. Making appropriate clinical decisions, of course, when errors are not assessed, when they're not assessed or assessed incorrectly, we give wrong services. We either, again, give them services they don't need, or we deny them services that they should. Some considerations to look at with a lot of our students. There are differences in sound repertoire between languages. So some of the sounds exist or don't exist in certain languages, and we have to look at that. So when they're excluding sounds, instead of automatically saying that they don't have these sounds, let's look at why. You know, whatever language they speak, whether you know that language or not, you can look it up online. You can find resources. There's so many resources that are starting to be out there, and see what are the main differences in that language. What are the sounds that are in the sound repertoire that match English? What are the ones that don't match English? And what can I do about it? The age of exposure. So how old were they when they were exposed to English? You know, even though they're born and raised in this country, people take for granted that they've been exposed to English since birth. A lot of families don't speak English at home. Sometimes their first exposure is when they get to school. So we have to look at that. We also have to look at, you know, some students, they're like, oh, they've lived here so many years, but you know, they've, you know, I have my high school therapist always like, oh, but they lived here like 10 years. And it's like, yes, but they also moved here after the language, you know, the age of acquisition of language. So it's harder, and they're always going to have a little bit of an accent or a little bit of a dialect or some influence in their languages they're talking about. And then the silent period, which I find a lot of people don't know about this. So raise of hands, how many people know what the silent period is? Oop. Great. I love that. I love seeing hands. The silent period is the time when a person is exposed to a new language. Sorry, I saw the chat pop up and then it disappeared. I wanted to see what was on it. It won't let me. Oh, there we go. I apologize. Okay, I do. Great. Absolutely. So the silent period, for those who don't know, is the time when, so say, for example, a student moves here from another country. They're in school. I get a lot of referrals for students who, you know, they're selectively mute, or they don't, you know, they don't speak. They must be autistic. They must be on the spectrum. They must have this issue, that issue. Teachers are diagnosing left and right. Parents are diagnosing them even. But it really is just a time when they are absorbing language. So think of these kids as like a sponge. They've got so much language, so much change going on around them, and they're just sucking it all in. They're absorbing it. And usually after the silent period is over, you know, they're usually very quiet. They're sitting next to their peers, maybe parallel playing a little bit. They might be looking at the teacher and staring at them with that death stare when they're talking to them, but they're not answering. And after the silent period ends, a lot of times language almost explodes. All of a sudden, they've got like full sentences in the new language, or they've got, you know, slang terms that they've heard, or things that, you know, things that the teacher thought they didn't understand. And suddenly they're giving them these answers right back and saying certain terms. And it's usually, like, when I say the terms, because it's usually the phrases that come out the most, those rote phrases that happen all the time, like you know, what's up, or what's going on, or how you doing, the things that we say and hear on a daily basis that are the ones that come out the most. And then the kids will suddenly say that perfectly a lot of times, and people are shocked, like, oh my gosh, they have all this language. And you relate. I love that you relate to that. And really, I have to educate, you know, a lot of people around me, because they don't know about it. And again, they're diagnosing these kids with something else going on. So influences on cultural decisions are based on the training you've received at the undergraduate, graduate level, and professional development, your level of cultural competence, your level of comfort with bilingual, multilingual assessment, and changes in mindset and understanding of multiple language learning. So if you assume that every variation in language that is different to yours is a disorder, then you are wrongly classifying clients, and you're discrediting their abilities. And we always have to keep that in mind. Just because it's different than the way you speak doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it. So dialectical differences. We always want to identify the common differences among select languages again. And we always want to have that discussion for select languages. So what I'm going to do right now is, I chose 3 languages. Do we still have time? Few minutes, or are we done? I don't hear you, I'm sorry. Yes, okay. So what I wanted to do was, I wanted to give some of the languages that tend to have, to be the most, you know, overly diagnosed. So Spanish. I want to give you some variations in the language, so to give you some exposure to some variations that might exist. So Spanish is a Romance language. It's a 27-letter alphabet. There are 5 vowel phonemes with no distinction between short and long vowels. The only 3 double letter combinations that exist are LL, RR, CC, and RR. So to give you some background to that, so English, of course, 24 letters in the alphabet, so you already got 3 more there. There are many more vowels in English. English has more than 14, depending on your regional dialect, so again, that can change. There's a lot of vowel confusion that occurs in Spanish speakers. The English alphabet does not have any accent to words. However, there is a strong accent to words in Spanish. There's a strong correspondence between letters and their sounds. So a lot of times you'll get that student that will phonetically correctly write a word, However, it's spelled wrong. And that's because, you know, sight words are just so difficult for them. They just don't make sense sometimes because they're like, but that letter should make this sound all the time. And that's because there's usually that correspondence in Spanish. Phonological systems are different in aspects of sentence stress and vowel sounds. You know, words can have an accent on them, like I said, the enya. And if anybody speaks Spanish and I said that incorrectly, please correct me. And again, we don't have that in English. Spanish learners will often reduce double letter combinations or overcompensate by doubling when it's not. So again, with those double letter combinations. So again, we have to understand these differences that can occur. There's also punctuation of direct speech is difficult to comprehend. There are no quotation marks in Spanish. So a lot of times I'll have students, you know, teachers will say, you know, my student really just doesn't understand when we're talking about dialogue and we're reading this narration. Or believe it or not, the drama teacher will come up to me and say, I just don't understand why they can't remember that this is dialogue and this is, you know, the side notes that they should be just doing on the side and not saying. And that's because those quotations don't exist. Adjectives come before noun in Spanish. Grammar is masculine or feminine. That does not exist in English. Verbs are conjugated based on your speaker. Syllables are mostly consonant vowel. And clusters typically have only 2 consonants. So in Spanish, a word cannot begin with an S cluster. So a lot of times, again, we're assessing these children and they have consonant cluster reduction. Is it truly consonant cluster reduction, or are we giving them the, you know, words in that sample that just don't exist in their language? Can we try a cluster that doesn't have S, you know, not an S cluster in the beginning of the word, and see if they can do it? And maybe they don't have cluster reduction. Maybe it's just they haven't been exposed to that type of a cluster. You know, again, some of the considerations that we don't look at. And because of that, you'll see a lot of people that speak Spanish will sometimes, like with certain words, will add an E or a schwa, or they'll remove the S. So instead of saying speak, they'll say tic. Instead of saying study, they'll say S-study, and they'll add that E in the beginning. So you'll hear that difference in their English speech. Arabic, I always like telling people the alphabet, so I'm going to say it out loud so people hear the difference, because they're always like, well, why do they have such a strong accent when they're speaking English? So the Arabic alphabet: Alef, Beh, Teh, Teh, Gim, Ha, Kha, Dal, Dal, Ra, Zain, Sin, Shin, Sad, Dad, Tah, Tha, Ain, Ghain, Fe, Kaf, Kaf, Lam, Mim, Nun, He, Waw, Ye. So if you notice, we have a lot of throat sounds that don't exist in English. And they will tend to add those sounds into a lot of the words that they hear. They'll tend to remove certain sounds. So Arabic is a Semitic language, similar to Hebrew, also a Semitic language. It's written from right to left in a cursive script. So there is no such thing as print versus cursive. Everything is written in cursive. Every letter attaches almost. Only some letters don't attach in certain examples. So again, teachers are like, well, why are they always writing everything, you know, attached to each other? We're supposed to be printing these letters into these words, and they want to automatically attach them together. There's 28 consonants, and only up to 2 consonant clusters in the beginning and ends of words. So again, consonant cluster reduction. You know, why are they cutting those consonants? Probably because they're not exposed to it and they're not used to it. There are 8 vowels and diphthongs. Vowels each have their distinct sounds. There are 3 primary vowels similar to I, A, and U. Mainly long vowels or diphthongs are used in Arabic. Short vowels are not very important. So again, when they are writing in English or speaking in English, they tend to cut out those short vowels in their written language or when they're speaking, because they're ignored in Arabic. There are only 3 short vowels that are in Arabic, and they are used interchangeably. So again, spelling errors that you might see a lot, you know, they're like, oh, they can't spell that word, or they keep spelling it wrong. Well, this is why. There are 6 phonemes in Arabic that are not found in English and have a very distinct sound. Some examples of the short vowels will be like mektab is an Arabic word. And for example, they will cut out, you know, in Arabic, it's actually written you know, if you were to translate the letters appropriately, it would be MKTB. So that's how they would spell it in Arabic. So now you're asking them to add all these vowels and write it in English. It's very hard for them to write it with an A, or you want them to add an E for that E sound. And a lot of those vowel sounds are often written through diacritical marks. So markings above and below the words to change the vowel intonation, which doesn't exist in English, as we know. There's no distinction between upper and lowercase letters. So again, a lot of times they will not use uppercase letters or capital letters on names or proper nouns because it doesn't exist in Arabic. It's just written as is. The contraction of the epiglottis occurs often while speaking. The phonemes P and V do not exist in Arabic. So this is where we were getting a lot of those referrals of, you know, B for P. So I always used to joke around when I was little. My mom used to always say peanut butter instead of peanut butter because it just, there was no P. And because these sounds, because of the English influence that has occurred in countries like Egypt and within the Middle East, they're actually created a new letter V. So there's a new letter in the Arabic alphabet with new markings just to represent some of these English stores and things that are coming in. Word stress occurs regularly. Again, not in English. There's stresses on so many sounds. And by putting the wrong stress on a word can actually change the meaning. So in English, we know that if we say object, we can also say that differently with a different stress and it becomes object. That doesn't occur in Arabic. If it's written that way, that's how it's said, unless you add those diacritical markings. So again, words like that will have a lot of difficulty with Arabic students. They want to just say it the one way and cannot understand why it's being said differently without any markings on it to change it. Punctuation is reversed. So punctuation is the other way around. Words are written the way that they are stated. So there's no sound elision. And, oh, I'm sorry, I put that twice. I apologize. Punctuation is reversed. I guess it was important. I wanted to stress that. Punctuation is a newer concept, as original Arabic had no punctuation. So again, that is a change that has happened in the language recently to include punctuation. And one more language that I wanted to go through here quickly, Chinese, because it has increased so much, especially in this region, I feel. So Northern Chinese or Mandarin is 70% of your Chinese language speaking. Other dialects can include Cantonese, Wu, Xiang, Gan, and others. It uses a logographic system, not an alphabet. So pinyin is their alphabet, which is their method of transliterated output. But there is no actual alphabet in Chinese. There are 21 consonants and 16 vowels and diphthongs. So a lot of vowels happening. And it's a tonal language. What that means is it uses pitch. The pitch of the phoneme is actually distinguishing the meaning of the word. So when your pitch changes, you'll hear a lot of sound change and going up and down in Chinese. And that is actually them changing the meaning of the word that they are stating. Tone is written as a superscript after the syllable, or as a marking on top of the first vowel after a consonant. And there are 5 tones, from mid-tone, high, rising, falling, and then an abrupt glottal stop. Tone can change the complete meaning of their speech. So for example, stated in a different tone can actually indicate confusion, can indicate sadness, can indicate all different types of emotions. So one time I was given a Chinese student, the teacher kept saying, I don't understand why she keeps getting so loud and it's so rude and I don't understand. And the teacher would constantly get in her face and just say, she's being so rude all the time with her loud voice. And when I found this out, I found out that that loud tone when she was saying certain words was actually being more respectful of her teacher. And so the teacher took something that was being respectful as disrespect for not understanding. There's minimal use of final consonants. So again, final consonant deletion. Is it really final consonant deletion? Or do they just not, they're just not used to having consonants at the ends of words? Less vowel sounds than in English. There's difficulty hearing difference between L and R. So that often will change their pronunciation of certain words. it's an uninflected language, so word meaning through order, adverbial, or shared understanding of context. There are no articles in Chinese, and modals in Chinese do not convey as much meaning as in English, which I thought was interesting as well. So modals in English are, ability, can and could, permission, should I, advice, maybe all of those modals, they don't convey the same amount of meaning. So again, I get so many referrals that the child is being rude, the child is being abrupt in their speech, they have no manners. These are all things that I've heard and have been stated to me for students that are Asian, and it's really just because they don't have that meaning in Chinese as they do in English. So that wraps up my presentation there. I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you, gracias, shukran in Arabic, and however else you say it. But I appreciate your time and staying on with me, and I hope that you enjoyed.